Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Satchmo Blows Up the World. Jazz Ambassadors Play the Cold War by Penny M. von Eschen. Narrated by Christina Delaine. Chapter 1. Ike Gets Dizzy. President Dwight D. Eisenhower got dizzy in 1956. Famed bebop trumpeter John Burke's Dizzy Gillespie, that is, when Gillespie's integrated band embarked on the first government-sponsored jazz tour of the Middle East, with the aid of the President's Emergency Fund. Perhaps the only thing this diplomatic odd couple had in common was that they were both transplanted Southerners. Gillespie had been born on October 21, 1917, in the sleepy backwater of Cheraw, South Carolina. The young John Burke's South was noted for its African-American sanctified church and its traveling jazz bands. He'd grown up in a house filled with instruments, getting his first trumpet from school and listening to national jazz broadcasts on a neighbor's radio. But Gillespie's South was also the South of ubiquitous white violence, the petty restrictions of Jim Crow segregation, and the crippling economic constraints that had led his family to relocate to Philadelphia in 1935. Gillespie would emerge from such humble beginnings as one of the most beloved and innovative musical geniuses of the 20th century. A highly spiritual humanist who expressed his vision of world peace through adherence to the Baha'i faith, Gillespie was also a rebel who boldly challenged white America's appropriation of black music by creating a new style of music that couldn't, the musicians hoped, be easily copied. When Eisenhower got dizzy, he certainly knew nothing of Gillespie's reputation as the hip and militant bebop artist who, in the mid-1940s, had teamed up with Charlie Parker and others to create the bebop revolution. The critic Whitney Balliet described Gillespie's style in the 1940s. Few trumpeters have ever been blessed with so much technique. Gillespie never merely started a solo, he erupted into it. He would hurl himself into the break, after a split-second pause with a couple of hundred notes that corkscrewed through several octaves, sometimes in triple time, and were carried in one breath, past the end of the break and well into the solo itself. Gillespie's style at the time gave the impression, with its sharp, slightly acid tone, its cleavered phrase endings, its efflorescence of notes, and its brandishings about in the upper register, of being constantly on the verge of flying apart. However, his playing was held together by his extraordinary rhythmic sense. If the phrase constantly on the verge of flying apart captures the sound and sensibility of Gillespie's trumpet, it is also an apt description of Dwight Eisenhower's South as the first jazz tours began. Eisenhower had been born in Texas in 1890 to a Southern mother. Raised in Abilene, Kansas, he was 6 years old when the Supreme Court established in Plessy v. Ferguson the separate but equal doctrine of racial segregation as the law of the land. As a boy, Eisenhower had often vacationed on a plantation with horse-drawn carriages driven by black servants. During an administration characterized by what the historian Thomas Borstelmann has described as the last hurrah of the old color line, Eisenhower was troubled that the Supreme Court, in its 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision, showed concern for the feelings of black school children rather than those of white Southern youngsters. He also resented the way the court's decision strained his relationship with white Southerners, and declared at a 1958 news conference that, from babyhood, I was raised to respect the word Confederate. Moreover, Eisenhower felt uneasy in the presence of black people in any but subordinate positions. And during his administration, the relatively easy access to the White House that prominent black Americans had enjoyed during the Truman years evaporated. If Eisenhower's world was turned upside down by the Brown decision, in December 1955, the same month that the Gillespie tour was approved, the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott, led by the young minister Martin Luther King Jr., inaugurated a new phase of the Black Freedom Movement, ensuring that the jazz tours and the modern civil rights movement would be forever joined. This unexpected joining of fates as Gillespie assumed the role of goodwill ambassador was doubly ironic, for with the stroke of a pen, this hitherto disreputable music, routinely associated in the mass media with drugs and crime, suddenly became America's music. Why did American policymakers feel for the first time in history that the country should be represented by jazz? With America in the throes of a political and cultural revolution that had put the black freedom struggle at the center of American and international politics, the prominence of African-American jazz artists was critical to the music's potential as a Cold War weapon. In the high-profile tours by Gillespie, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and many others, U.S. officials pursued a self-conscious campaign against worldwide criticism of U.S. racism, striving to build cordial relations with new African and Asian states. The glaring contradiction in this strategy was that the U.S. promoted black artists as goodwill ambassadors, symbols of the triumph of American democracy, when America was still a Jim Crow nation. Indeed, the primary contradiction of promoting African American artists as symbols of a racial equality yet to be achieved would fundamentally shape the organization and ideologies of the tours, as well as the ways in which the tours were contested by artists, and that U.S. officials would simultaneously insist on the universal race-transcending quality of jazz, while depending on the blackness of musicians to legitimize America's global agendas, was an abiding paradox of the tours. Intended to promote a vision of colorblind American democracy, the tours foregrounded the importance of African American culture during the Cold War, with blackness and race operating culturally to project an image of American nationhood that was more inclusive than the reality. When President Eisenhower requested special appropriations in cultural and artistic fields from the Senate in August 1954, he cited the fabulous success of Porgy and Bess, playing to capacity houses in the extended tour of the free countries of Europe. It is hardly surprising that Eisenhower supported cultural programs. He resented Europeans' depiction of the country as a race of materialists, and was distressed that our successes are described in terms of automobiles, and not in terms of worthwhile culture of any kind. But the fact that Eisenhower, resistant to change when it came to American race relations, named Porgy and Bess as an example of the importance of American culture abroad is telling. The Eisenhower administration had tried to counter Soviet charges of American racism through its financing of the 4-year Cold War tour of Porgy and Bess. Performed throughout the United States, Europe, South America, and the Middle East, the production was directed by Robert Breed and featured Cab Calloway, opera star William Warfield as Porgy, and future opera star Leontine Price as Bess. The rhetoric and tension surrounding the Porgy tour foreshadowed the way struggles over artistic control and representations of race would intersect with shifting civil rights and Cold War politics throughout the period of the jazz tours. Thus, despite the government's complacency on domestic race relations, even Eisenhower was profoundly affected by the widely shared sense that race was America's Achilles heel internationally. This insight shaped the government's cultural presentation programs and resulted in the relative prominence of Black American artists in the tours and the premium placed on integrated performance groups in all areas of the arts. It also produced the sense of urgency that would animate the tours. Cultural presentation programs reflected the confidence that American leaders and diplomats felt in their ability to solve any problem and shape any situation to their liking. Writing to Secretary of State Johnson Foster Dulles, Eisenhower described the initial $5 million budget as funds to be used at my discretion to meet extraordinary or unusual circumstances arising in the international field, and requested that Dulles maintain close personal contact with the program. Indeed, in what might be described as a can-do foreign policy culture, which extended across Democratic as well as Republican administrations, Policymakers exhibited extraordinary confidence in America's ability to shape the world.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?